Antoinette Concello was the greatest female aerialist in Ringling history, but her marriage was just a contract for physical exploitation. Her husband and manager forced her to execute death-defying somersaults until her spine was literally fracturing. Instead of medical care, she was fed painkillers to ensure the show's biggest cash cow never stopped flying. This is the brutal, unvarnished reality of a woman physically destroyed by the man she married, all to feed the circus machine. Born in 1910, her early developmental years were defined by absolute systemic abandonment. By 1923, she was an adolescent living as a ward of the state, deposited into the cold institutional care of a convent in Burlington, Vermont. To understand her psychological baseline, we must analyze what it meant to be a female orphan in the 1920s. She possessed zero social capital. She had no familial safety net, no financial inheritance, and no advocates. The economic reality for a girl in her specific demographic offered a terrifyingly narrow set of trajectories: domestic servitude, menial and dangerous factory labor, or institutionalized poverty. In an era before comprehensive social welfare, a child without a family was essentially an invisible entity, entirely vulnerable to the predatory mechanics of the adult world. When a human being is deprived of foundational attachment and security during their formative years, the psychological result is often a profound, overwhelming neurological craving for external validation. Antoinette did not possess an inherent intrinsic sense of self-worth because the environment that raised her had never provided one. Her value had to be constantly proven. When she fled the confines of the convent at the age of 16 and gravitated toward the traveling circus, she was not merely running away to join a spectacle. She was actively seeking a system that would assign her a definitive value. The circus offered a brutal but clear meritocracy. If you could endure the pain and generate the applause, you were permitted to belong. However, the circus industry did not hand out validation freely. Before she could ever touch the pristine canvas of the flying trapeze, Antoinette was required to pass a grueling physical initiation. She had to prove her threshold for agony. Her entry into the biomechanical meat grinder of the entertainment world was an act known in the trade as the iron jaw. The iron jaw is a masterclass in anatomical horror disguised as entertainment. The routine required the performer to bite down on a custom-fitted thick leather mouthpiece that was attached directly to a heavy rigging line. Once the performer locked their jaw, the stagehands would operate the winches, hoisting the woman high into the air, where she would hang suspended, often spinning rapidly, entirely supported by the grip of her own teeth. The human temporomandibular joint, the jaw, is evolutionary engineered for the mastication of food. It is supported by the masseter muscles, which are powerful, but they are designed to exert upward crushing force, not to withstand a massive sustained downward pull. Furthermore, the cervical spine, consisting of the 7 delicate vertebrae in the neck, was never designed to bear the static, suspended weight of an entire human torso pulling downward against the anchor of the skull. When Antoinette was hoisted into the air by her teeth, she was subjecting her cervical discs to severe, unnatural traction. The intervertebral spaces were violently stretched, risking disc herniation and severe chronic nerve impingement. The muscles in her neck and jaw would instantly cramp under the extreme hydrostatic pressure. As she was spun in circles, centrifugal force forced blood into her cranium, increasing intracranial pressure and causing severe disorientation. Every single performance was an agonizing test of skeletal endurance, where a momentary lapse in jaw tension meant a fatal plummet to the arena floor. She endured this daily physical torture for a very specific psychological reason. She was operating under a desperate, combative internal mantra. If a man can do it, why can't I? She was attempting to carve out a space for herself in a hypermasculine environment by outsuffering her male counterparts. She was learning the foundational lesson of the circus economy. Her flesh was not her own. It was a mechanism to hold the audience's attention. And the more she endured, the more securely she was tied to the very body that brought her recognition. The pain was normalized. The pain was the rent she paid to avoid returning to the institutional anonymity of the orphanage. It was during this critical period of extreme physical exertion and psychological desperation that she was identified by Arthur Art Concello. Art Concello was not a romantic hero, nor was he a benevolent mentor. In the clinical reality of the circus hierarchy, he was an apex predator and a highly calculating corporate scout. He was a rising star in the aerial world, possessing an unparalleled understanding of both the biomechanics of the flying trapeze and the ruthless, profit-driven economics of the Ringling brothers' empire. When Concello observed Antoinette performing the iron jaw, he did not see a vulnerable teenager in need of protection. He saw a highly resilient, deeply ambitious piece of biological machinery that was currently being underutilized. Concello recognized a fundamental truth about the entertainment market that would dictate the rest of Antoinette's life. He knew that the public possessed a specific voyeuristic appetite for female vulnerability. A man performing a highly dangerous, lethal aerial trick is impressive. It aligns with traditional expectations of masculine bravery. But a beautiful, seemingly fragile woman performing that exact same lethal trick is infinitely more profitable. The contrast between her delicate aesthetic and the extreme violent risk she undertakes creates a highly marketable cognitive dissonance. The audience watches with a heightened sense of terror, waiting to see if the beautiful object will shatter. Concello stepped into Antoinette's life and initiated a textbook process of psychological grooming. He recognized her profound, desperate need for a stabilizing figure and her fierce ambition to prove herself equal to the men. He did not discourage this ambition. He weaponized it. He offered to train her, to elevate her from the brutal, lower-tier act of the iron jaw to the absolute pinnacle of circus royalty, the flying trapeze. To a teenage orphan, this attention from a powerful, established older man was intoxicating. It masqueraded as love and mentorship. In reality, it was a calculated asset acquisition. Art Concello was systematically transitioning her from an independent, albeit exploited performer into his own personal corporate leverage. The transition to the flying trapeze fundamentally altered the power dynamic between them. In the architecture of a flying act, there are two primary roles: the catcher and the flyer. The catcher hangs upside down from a stationary catch trap, locking their knees into the rigging. Their role requires strength and precise timing, but it is a highly controlled, statistically safer position. The flyer is the projectile. The flyer is the one who climbs the 40-foot pedestal, launches their body into the void, and executes the rapid, disorienting rotations in midair. The flyer absorbs the massive kinetic shock of the deceleration. The flyer takes the absolute majority of the physical risk. Art Concello positioned himself firmly on the catch trap, and he positioned Antoinette on the flybar. This spatial arrangement perfectly mirrored their psychological and economic relationship. Art remained in the secure, controlling position. managing the timing, dictating the schedule, and interacting with the circus executives on the ground. Antoinette was transformed into the human projectile, the entity absorbing the blunt force trauma, the one risking a snapped neck or a shattered shoulder every single night. He allowed her to take the lethal risks because her body was the magnet that drew the massive crowds, generating the capital that he would subsequently control. This dynamic was permanently codified when they married. To the press and the public, the marriage of Art and Antoinette Concello was heavily promoted as the ultimate circus fairy tale. They were marketed as the king and queen of the air, a husband and wife team conquering gravity together. The clinical reality behind the canvas was a vertical integration of assets. By marrying her, Art Concello legally and socially consolidated his total control over her physical output. In a standard corporate environment, an employee facing dangerous working conditions possesses the theoretical ability to leave the workplace, return home, and seek counsel from a spouse or partner. Antoinette possessed no such sanctuary. The man who dictated her grueling professional schedule, the man who calculated the acceptable level of physical risk she must undertake, was the exact same man sleeping in her bed. The boundaries between employer, manager, trainer, and husband were completely obliterated. She was caught in a closed loop. The man dictating her schedule and her safety was the same man she went home to. If she complained of physical pain, she was not just disappointing her boss. She was betraying her husband. Art had successfully engineered an environment where Antoinette's own psychological need for his approval overrode her biological survival instincts. With his control fully established, Art Concello initiated the final phase of his corporate strategy. He recognized that to truly dominate the Ringling brothers and Barnum and Bailey hierarchy, a standard flying act was insufficient. They needed a marquee spectacle. They needed the impossible. He decreed that Antoinette must learn and perform the triple somersault. The triple somersault was the holy grail of aerialism. It was a maneuver so physically devastating and neurologically complex that very few men had ever achieved it reliably, and no woman had ever executed it as a standard feature of her act. It was widely considered a lethal gamble. The centrifugal force generated by 3 rapid rotations in midair pulls the blood violently away from the brain, risking momentary blackouts. The flyer completely loses visual contact with their environment, relying entirely on a silent internal biological clock to know exactly when to uncoil and present their wrist to the catcher. If the timing is off by a fraction of a second, the flyer plummets to the net at a catastrophic angle, risking severe spinal compression. Art Concello did not push his wife to attempt the triple somersault out of a desire for her personal artistic fulfillment. He pushed her because the triple guaranteed center ring billing, maximum media exposure, and unparalleled leverage with the Ringling ownership. He was utilizing his wife's ambition and her desperate desire to please him as a battering ram to break into the executive class of the circus industry. Antoinette, driven by the psychological grooming that equated her worth entirely with her physical performance, accepted the mandate. She threw her body into the agonizing, violent process of learning the trick. She endured the brutal falls into the rigid hemp safety net, the severe concussions, and the deep tissue contusions. She essentially beat her central nervous system into submission, training her muscles to execute the highly dangerous rotations, while her brain was deprived of oxygen and visual data. Through sheer terrifying force of will and immense physical suffering, Antoinette mastered the maneuver. She became the first woman in history to reliably execute the triple somersault. The public response was explosive. The crowds flocked to the Ringling tents, desperate to see the beautiful petite woman defy the laws of physics and biology. She became an international superstar, her image plastered on billboards and magazines across the continent. But the victory was a profound, tragic illusion. The audience saw the effortless grace, the sequined costume, and the radiant smile presented to the spotlight. They perceived an empowered woman operating at the absolute pinnacle of human capability. They were entirely blind to the agonizing physiological reality occurring behind the curtain. They did not see the severe compounding trauma being inflicted upon her joints, nor did they understand that the beautiful spectacle before them was built entirely upon the slow, deliberate destruction of her own anatomy. Antoinette believed she had conquered the air and proven herself equal to any man. In reality, she had merely succeeded in transforming her own flesh into the most valuable asset in her husband's portfolio. She was not a goddess of the air. She wasn't a wife or a partner. She was simply a tool that generated ticket sales. And like any tool, she was being worn down to the breaking point. The centrifugal force of the triple somersault was generating massive wealth, but the physical bill for that wealth was entirely assigned to Antoinette's shoulders. The trap had been flawlessly executed, and the slow, agonizing process of her biological and psychological destruction had officially begun. The central deception of the 20th century circus industry relies entirely upon a highly engineered visual misdirection. The audience purchases a ticket to consume an aesthetic experience. When they directed their gaze upward into the canvas apex of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, they saw Antoinette Concello. They saw the glittering sequins catching the harsh carbon arc spotlights. They saw the immaculate makeup, the perfectly coiffed hair, and the effortless, radiant smile presented immediately after a death-defying drop. The industry sold them the illusion of a superhuman goddess, a woman who had gracefully conquered the absolute laws of gravity. But this aesthetic perfection was a deliberate, highly manufactured smokescreen designed to obscure a horrific, ongoing biological tragedy. The woman suspended 40 feet in the air was not a goddess. She was a fragile, rapidly deteriorating piece of biological machinery, pushed to the absolute brink of anatomical failure by a corporate system that viewed her solely as a high-yield, expendable asset. In the late 1930s, Antoinette Concello achieved what was widely considered a physical impossibility for a female anatomy. She reliably executed 3 rapid, consecutive backward rotations in midair, catching the hands of her partner before swinging safely to the platform. The press heralded it as a triumph of the human spirit. The reality is that it was a daily, systematic destruction of human tissue. The sequence begins on the pedestal board. Antoinette grasps the heavy canvas-wrapped flybar. She steps off into the void, utilizing her body weight to generate massive kinetic energy. As she reaches the absolute apex of the forward swing, where potential energy is at its highest, she releases the bar. At this precise millisecond, she becomes an unguided projectile, traveling at approximately 30 miles per hour. To achieve 3 full rotations before gravity pulls her out of the catcher's reach, she must violently contract her abdominal core, driving her knees into her chest to create the tightest possible aerodynamic sphere. This rapid, violent rotation generates immense centrifugal force. In aerospace medicine, It is a recognized fact that extreme centrifugal force pulls the blood volume away from the brain, pooling it in the lower extremities. As Antoinette spun blindly through the air, her cerebral blood pressure plummeted. Her visual field blurred. She was effectively blinding and suffocating her own neurological sensors while hurtling through empty space. She had to rely entirely on proprioception, the central nervous system's subconscious mapping of the body in space, and a deeply ingrained silent biological clock to know exactly when to break the tuck. She had to violently uncoil her body, extending her arms backward, completely blind to her target, trusting that the catcher would be precisely there to meet her. But rotation is not the mechanism of destruction. The true anatomical horror of the flying trapeze occurs in the fraction of a second known as the catch. The human shoulder is the most mobile joint in the body, but consequently the most unstable. It is not engineered to absorb the sudden violent deceleration of a body dropping through the air at 30 miles per hour. Every time Antoinette completed the triple somersault, the immense kinetic load violently yanked the head of her humerus downward. Microscopic tears formed in her rotator cuff, and the articular cartilage absorbed the blunt force, inevitably grinding down. This was not an accident. It was her daily contractual obligation. By the early 1940s, the biological ledger could no longer be ignored. Antoinette Concello's right shoulder was fundamentally destroyed. The repetitive subluxation, the partial dislocation of the joint during the catch, had shredded her labrum. The pain was no longer a dull ache that could be massaged away. It was a sharp, blinding neuropathic agony that radiated down her arm every time she lifted it above her head. In a rational civilian occupational framework, an injury of this catastrophic magnitude mandates immediate, permanent retirement. The worker is immobilized, subjected to intensive orthopedic surgery to repair the torn tissue, and placed on a long-term medical pension. But the Ringling Brothers corporate machine did not recognize the biological limitations of its assets, and it certainly did not offer pensions to broken flyers. More importantly, the primary architect of her exploitation, her husband and manager, Art Concello, refused to let the machine power down. Art had utilized Antoinette's physical courage and her desperate psychological need for his approval to build his own reputation. He had positioned her as the primary risk-taker, the human projectile who absorbed the kinetic trauma, while he remained safely on the catch trap or on the ground, directing the act and negotiating the lucrative contracts based entirely on her ability to execute the triple. When her shoulder began to fail, Art did not prioritize her long-term physical health. He prioritized the maintenance of his asset. Antoinette was subjected to a series of agonizing invasive surgeries. In the 1940s, sports medicine was incredibly rudimentary. These surgeries were not designed to return her shoulder to a state of healthy, pain-free civilian function. They were desperate, mechanical patching jobs. The surgeons essentially used heavy sutures to artificially bind her shredded ligaments together, deliberately restricting the natural range of motion in her shoulder. To prevent the arm from completely ripping out of the socket during the catch, they were essentially applying medical duct tape to a failing engine just to guarantee it could run for a few more seasons. And the moment the sutures healed enough to bear weight, she was forced right back up the 40-foot ladder. The Ringling schedule demanded the queen of the air. Antoinette was trapped in a highly toxic psychological panopticon. She had been groomed since her departure from the orphanage to believe that her only intrinsic value as a human being was her ability to perform. Furthermore, the man dictating her schedule, the man pushing her back into the air, despite her failing anatomy, the man who dictated her grueling professional schedule, the man who mathematically calculated the acceptable level of lethal physical risk she was contractually obligated to undertake every single night, was the exact same man sleeping in her bed. Arthur Concello had achieved total control over her existence. In the transient world of the traveling circus, there was no human resources department, no union representative, and no safe harbor. Art Concello controlled her physical safety on the rigging, her financial reality in the ledger, and her professional trajectory within the Ringling Brothers empire. This immense, inescapable power imbalance created a highly toxic, deeply volatile environment that completely obliterated the boundaries between employer, manager, trainer, and husband. If Antoinette complained of the blinding neuropathic agony in her shredded right shoulder, she was not merely filing a workplace grievance. She was actively defying her husband. If she hesitated on the pedestal board, terrified of executing the triple somersault with a failing joint, she was not just failing the Ringling Corporation, she was failing the man who controlled her access to basic human affection. Art had successfully engineered a closed-loop system of coercion. He utilized her deep-seated, institutionalized fear of abandonment, the core trauma of the orphaned child, to override her biological survival instincts. She flew, she suffered, and she bled, all to maintain the approval of her warden. However, a system built on extreme physical extraction and psychological suppression is inherently unstable. You cannot subject a human central nervous system to decades of fight-or-flight hypervigilance, and you cannot subject a skeletal structure to decades of violent kinetic deceleration without eventually reaching a catastrophic breaking point. For Antoinette Concello, the biological bill finally came due in the early 1950s. Despite the agonizing surgeries, the heavy adhesive strapping, and the massive influx of nicotine required to suppress the pain, the physical architecture of her right shoulder completely collapsed. The repetitive subluxation, the violent pulling of the humerus out of the socket during the catch, had eradicated the articular cartilage. The ligaments were stretched beyond any functional utility. The joint could simply no longer bear the immense G-force required to execute the triple somersault. In 1953, the clinical reality could no longer be ignored or medicated away. Antoinette Concello, the woman who had defined the female flying trapeze for an entire generation, was forced into permanent retirement. She was officially grounded. Since the age of 16, her entire self-worth, her public persona, and her value to her husband had been entirely predicated on her ability to perform lethal acrobatics. When her shoulder failed, she experienced a profound ego death. She was a machine that had lost its primary function. In a functioning, empathetic marriage, this catastrophic, career-ending transition would be managed with psychological support, medical care, and a reevaluation of the partnership. But the Concello marriage was not built on empathy. It was built exclusively on utility. When Antoinette could no longer climb the 40-foot ladder and execute the trick that sold the tickets, her primary value to Art Concello instantly evaporated. The biological asset was fully depreciated. Art Concello's reaction to his wife's physical collapse is a masterclass in the cold arithmetic of corporate extraction. He did not mourn the loss of her career. He did not offer comfort to the woman who had sacrificed her cartilage to build his corporate empire. He immediately sought a functional replacement. Art, now operating at the highest executive levels of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, began a highly public, humiliating affair with a much younger performer named Maggie Smith. This betrayal was not merely a standard act of marital infidelity. It was a profound systemic degradation. It was a calculated display of absolute power. The man who had exploited Antoinette's physical courage, the man who had built his executive throne on the destruction of her shoulders, was now callously discarding her for a newer, undamaged model. He paraded his new acquisition in front of the entire circus community. He was broadcasting a very clear, brutal message. Women in his orbit were valued solely for their physical utility, whether that utility was acrobatic performance or sexual availability. Once the utility was exhausted, the woman was obsolete. For Antoinette, the psychological impact was a rapid descent into absolute despair. She was forced to remain within the circus environment, physically broken, watching her husband flaunt his mistress. She had traded her youth, her health, and her basic safety for his approval and the security of the Ringling machine. Now, stripped of her physical leverage, she was entirely powerless. But the patriarchal system consistently makes a fatal miscalculation regarding female endurance. The men who operate these machines assume that a woman trained to silently endure severe physical pain will also silently endure severe psychological humiliation. They assume the conditioning is absolute. They fail to recognize that silent, stoic endurance does not dissipate. It merely ferments. The same fierce, combative ambition that drove Antoinette to execute the triple somersault, the internal fire that demanded she prove herself equal to any man, was not extinguished by a torn rotator cuff. It was simply redirected. The silent endurance fractured, giving way to a profound, suffocating, and ultimately explosive rage. She had been treated as a disposable tool for 30 years. She had been manipulated, gaslit, and physically mutilated. And when a human being is pushed into an absolute corner, stripped of their identity, and humiliated by their captor, the resulting reaction is rarely peaceful. In the autumn of 1953, the simmering toxic tension within the Concello orbit reached a violent, blood-soaked climax. We must examine the events of October 1953 with the cold detachment of a ballistic report. The Ringling Brothers Circus was encamped. The environment of a traveling circus at night is chaotic, transient, and heavily shadowed. Maggie Smith, Art Concello's young mistress, was walking through the darkened circus grounds. From the shadows, an unseen assailant opened fire. The immediate aftermath of the shooting reveals the deeply corrupt, insular nature of the circus industry. In the civilian world, an attempted assassination triggers a massive, highly publicized police investigation. Crime scenes are secured, ballistics are matched, and suspects are interrogated. But the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus operated as a sovereign state. They possessed their own internal security, their own codes of conduct, and a pathological terror of bad publicity. A scandalous love triangle resulting in the attempted murder of a performer by the wife of the general manager was a corporate nightmare that threatened to derail ticket sales and attract unwanted federal scrutiny. The circus immediately closed ranks. A wall of silence, known as the Circus Omerta, descended upon the encampment. Witnesses suddenly remembered nothing. Physical evidence vanished. A thorough, independent police investigation was actively discouraged and stonewalled by the Ringling executive management. Officially, no arrests were ever made. The shooter remained a legally unidentified phantom. Maggie Smith survived, but the message had been delivered with absolute, lethal clarity. However, within the closed circles of circus historians, the veteran performers of the era, and the clinical analysts who study the psychology of domestic abuse, the consensus is chillingly uniform. When you evaluate the motive, the opportunity, the access to firearms within the transient circus community, and the profound psychological profile of the individuals involved, all vectors point to a singular conclusion. Within the closed circles of circus historians and veteran performers, whispers and rumors have persisted for decades. Some suggest that Antoinette, pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance and stripped of her leverage, might have been the one to pull the trigger, a violent reclamation of agency from a tyrant. However, the truth remains buried in circus lore. No charges were ever filed, and the identity of the shooter remains a fiercely debated mystery. The shooting radically altered the power dynamic. It shattered the illusion of Art Concello's absolute control. The tyrant had been challenged in the most brutal, undeniable language possible. Immediately following the assassination attempt, the facade of the Concello marriage was permanently dismantled. The psychological chains were broken. Antoinette did not wait for Art to discard her entirely. She initiated the final severing. She filed for divorce. The legal proceedings were finalized, completely severing her ties with the man who had controlled her existence since she was a desperate teenager fleeing a Vermont convent. She walked away from the marriage physically broken. Her right shoulder was a landscape of surgical scars and degraded cartilage. Her lungs were heavily compromised by years of chain smoking. Her career as the Queen of the Air was permanently extinguished. By all standard sociological metrics, she was a discarded asset, destined to fade into the tragic obscurity that awaited most retired female performers. Art Concello retained his executive suite. He retained his wealth. He retained his power over the Ringling Empire. The patriarchal machine appeared to have successfully consumed another woman and moved on without consequence. But the industry was about to learn a terrifying lesson about the resilience of a woman who has nothing left to lose. Antoinette Concello had lost her ability to fly, but she had not lost her mind. She possessed a terrifying encyclopedic knowledge of the circus machine, and she was preparing to orchestrate the most brilliant, ruthless, and satisfying corporate revenge in the history of the entertainment industry. The narrative arc of the exploited female performer within the 20th century entertainment complex is highly predictable, dictated by a ruthless biological and economic algorithm. When the physical anatomy fails, when the cartilage degrades, the ligaments snap, and the aesthetic utility of youth evaporates, the patriarchal machine executes a standard protocol of disposal. The woman is stripped of her contracts, quietly erased from the promotional materials, and systematically replaced by a younger, structurally intact biological asset. The discarded performer is then expected to fade silently into the grim statistics of the era: severe depression, crippling poverty, or lethal substance abuse, completely isolated from the only world that ever assigned her value. Antoinette Concello looked at this highly engineered, statistically certain trajectory, and she absolutely refused to comply. Following the collapse of their marriage in the late 1950s, Art Concello believed he had successfully excised a depreciated asset. He retained his tailored suits, his executive salary, and his absolute authority as the general manager of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. He operated under the fatal, arrogant assumption that his power was intrinsic to his gender and his intellect, completely ignoring the fact that his entire corporate empire had been built upon the shredded connective tissue of his ex-wife. However, the psychological traits that make a successful parasitic exploiter are the exact same traits that inevitably destroy executive stability. Art Concello's management style was heavily defined by the same authoritarian, combative, and deeply arrogant mechanics he had utilized to control Antoinette. He brought his dictatorial contempt out of the bedroom and into the boardroom. He treated the Ringling corporate board, the investors, and the logistics personnel with the exact same ruthless aggression. This is the fatal flaw of the patriarchal tyrant. They assume the machine they manage will always submit to their hostility. But a multi-million-dollar entertainment monopoly does not tolerate friction that threatens its profit margins. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Art Concello's insubordination, his aggressive corporate posturing, and his relentless alienation of key stakeholders finally reached a critical threshold. In a massive, ruthless corporate restructuring, the Ringling ownership executed a sudden and absolute termination. Arthur Concello, the man who had controlled the daily operations of the greatest circus on earth, was unceremoniously fired. The sovereign was dragged from the throne. The man who had discarded Antoinette when her shoulder failed was now discarded by the corporation when his ego became a liability. The sudden removal of Art Concello created a massive, highly dangerous operational void within the Ringling infrastructure. The logistics of a global circus are staggeringly complex, but the most lethal and technically demanding aspect of the entire operation is the aerial rigging. Managing dozens of flyers requires an unparalleled, highly specific expertise. It means calculating the tensile strength of canvas ropes. It means ensuring the precise mathematical distances between the pedestal boards and the catch traps. Above all, it requires the psychological management of performers who risk their lives twice a day. It is a discipline where a single millimeter of miscalculation results in immediate, highly public fatalities. The Ringling executives surveyed their remaining management pool and realized a terrifying truth. The corporate suits did not understand the physics of the air. They needed a specialist. They needed someone who possessed an encyclopedic, microscopic understanding of aerial biomechanics, corporate scheduling, and the intense psychological pressure of the performers. There was only one human being alive who possessed the requisite technical knowledge, the absolute respect of the performers, and the iron-willed discipline required to manage the airspace. The Ringling Corporation sent a telegram to Antoinette Concello. We must pause to appreciate the profound seismic shift in the power dynamic occurring in this exact moment. A few years prior, Antoinette had been a broken, discarded hostage, fleeing a violent domestic dictatorship with a surgically reconstructed shoulder and compromised lungs. Now the massive corporate entity that had funded her exploitation was begging for her intellectual capital. Antoinette accepted the offer, but she did not return to the circus as a submissive employee. She did not return to the sawdust floor. She returned in a tailored executive suit. She was appointed as the aerial director of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. This appointment was an act of supreme, undeniable corporate and systemic empowerment. In the mid-20th century, the executive management and creative direction of the circus industry was an exclusive, highly guarded, impenetrable boys' club. Women were strictly categorized as visual commodities, biological assets to be displayed, utilized, and managed by men. For a woman to step into a position of absolute high-level logistical authority was a total violation of the industry's foundational hierarchy. Antoinette Concello walked back into the very machine that had ground down her cartilage. But this time, she held the levers of power. She completely, surgically usurped the territory that had previously been dominated by the men who had exploited her. As aerial director, her authority was absolute. From the early 1960s through to her final retirement in 1983, Antoinette was the ultimate unquestioned sovereign of the American circus airspace. She was no longer the desperate orphan seeking validation through physical pain. She was the architect of the spectacle. Antoinette possessed a terrifying microscopic understanding of how the industry attempted to exploit young women because she had been its primary victim. She knew exactly how male managers use psychological grooming, the promise of fame, and the threat of replacement to force female performers into executing dangerous, anatomically destructive maneuvers. As the gatekeeper, she systematically dismantled these predatory mechanics within her domain. She personally recruited, trained, and managed the new generations of female aerialists and the ballet girls, the massive troops of women who performed the synchronized aerial web routines. She did not manage them with gentle maternal affection. She managed them with the cold, hard, unyielding discipline of a survivor. She demanded absolute physical perfection, rigorous conditioning, and strict adherence to safety protocols. If a male rigger miscalculated the tension on a safety line, she did not politely correct him. She utilized her executive authority to terminate his employment. She commanded the men who built the scaffolding, and they obeyed her not out of chivalry, but out of genuine, deeply ingrained professional fear and respect. They knew they could not manipulate or deceive her because she possessed the surgical scars to prove she had survived the absolute worst the rigging could inflict. Her destroyed right shoulder, the joint that had been shredded by the triple somersault, was no longer a symbol of her victimization. It was her primary credential. It was the physical proof of her ultimate authority. Furthermore, she provided a level of psychological and technical protection to the young women under her command that she had never received from Art Concello. She controlled the choreography, ensuring that the acts were visually spectacular but biomechanically survivable. She dictated the contracts, ensuring the women were compensated for their physical risk. She acted as an impenetrable barrier between the vulnerable young performers and the predatory corporate executives who viewed them merely as expendable meat. She had survived the meat grinder, and she dedicated the second half of her life to controlling the speed of its blades. This is the ultimate, most sophisticated evolution of the survivor. Antoinette Concello did not allow the destruction of her physical body to dictate the end of her relevance. She understood a fundamental, ruthless truth about the capitalist system. Physical capital, the aesthetic beauty and the athletic capability of youth, is highly finite and rapidly depreciates. Intellectual capital, operational expertise, and executive ruthlessness, however, appreciate over time. When her flesh failed, she seamlessly transitioned her primary currency. She weaponized her intellect, her unparalleled experience, and her sheer, unbreakable psychological endurance. She took the massive entertainment empire built by the men who exploited her, and she ran its most dangerous division better, safer, and more efficiently than they ever could. Antoinette Concello died in 1984. The cause was not a catastrophic fall from the rigging, but lung cancer, a grim toll extracted by decades of the heavy smoking she used to survive the physical and psychological agony of her youth. Today, while some historians prefer the sanitized, romantic image of the Queen of the Air, her true legacy is far more profound. She was a woman pushed to the absolute brink of anatomical failure, who refused to be discarded. When her body could no longer fly, she stepped onto solid ground and took absolute control of the very machine that once controlled her.